Hey everyone, and welcome back to IDEANTHRO Movement. Well, on today's episode, when it comes to movement, there's no such thing as good and bad technique. In the last episode, we introduced a concept called bounded randomness, and this is the way we think about adding variety into our movement practice, which, as we talked about in the episode before that, variety is a really important part of our movement practice. And we use bounded randomness as a way to introduce that in an easy and accessible way. A way that doesn't take heaps of our energy just thinking up ways to do movement in lots of varieties. But bounded randomness, at the beginning of that last episode, I kind of skirted around this issue that if you hear the term bounded randomness, you could be forgiven for just focusing in on the randomness term and thinking, oh, if they're doing randomness, isn't that a little bit unsafe? Doesn't that mean they might be doing some things that are bad technique? Well, in this episode, we're going to explain why thinking about movements or techniques or exercises in the gym as good or bad kind of misses the point. Now, it's not to say, note here that I've said there's no such thing as good and bad technique. But there are certainly some things, lest anyone turns off now and says, he said there's no such thing as bad technique. No. There are certainly things that you can do from a movement perspective that are dangerous and therefore bad. But bear with me here for the nuance of this discussion. So, let's look at this the way that the typical fitness industry would look at movement. The typical fitness industry would pick a movement, let's say that it's a squat, let's say. And that person's going to squat down. There are certain ways that it is considered best to do a squat. Let's assume that we're doing a back squat. So there's a barbell across our back. We're going to squat down. Certain things that you should do: knees track over the toes, maintain a neutral position through the spine, descend to an appropriate depth given your abilities and your ranges of motion, different ways that you could brace. Whole bunch of different things that could go into that technique. Now, so let's say we say, okay, that's the right way to squat. Well, now let's look at something like a rotational squat. A squat where we rotate down. Looks very, very different. Fundamentally, it's a squat. We have lowered ourselves down into this. It's not a deadlift. We're not lying down. It's a squat, but it looks very, very different. The thing here is that different movements serve different purposes. So the back squat, let's say, the back squat is a good way to shift weight up and down in a vertical plane. It's a rubbish way to change direction. The rotational squat is a less appropriate way to shift weight up and down. You could still shift weight up and down like that, but the reality is you're going to run into a limit as to what it is that you can move. But it much more closely resembles a change of direction when running. So, we start to get this concept here where movement is relative to the task that's being asked of us. So judging whether a movement or a technique is good or bad needs us to consider the task that's being performed. Here's the thing though. Is the rotational squat actually unsound in any way? I can keep a neutral spine. My knee is actually in a safe position. I know it's tracking in, and people who are used to the cue knees out might be like, oh, that's a problem. It's not, because it's still lining up with the hip joint and the ankle joint and tracking nicely. The reality is the rotational squat is still a biomechanically sound position. My ankle hasn't collapsed. It's still a biomechanically sound position. It's just not the best way to shift weight. It's in the same way that the barbell back squat is a fundamentally sound way to shift weight, but it's not the best way to change direction. You can change direction fairly safely using a barbell back squat type of movement, but it's clunky as. And so we have a situation where just because a movement isn't optimal for the task that's being performed, doesn't mean that it's unsafe or bad. And so this apparent dichotomy between good movement and bad movement is actually more nuanced. There's certainly some things that are bad movement, right? Being whacked in the side of the knee with a 100-kilo footballer is bad movement for you. Probably not particularly bad for them, but it's bad movement for you. Doing a rotational squat with load isn't necessarily bad. It's just not as optimal as doing a barbell back squat with load. So you see here, the spectrum turns from good versus bad into bad at one end. Firstly, it's actually no longer a spectrum. Strictly speaking, it's a continuum. Bad movement at one end, and then acceptable movement extending out from that the other way. And then right down the opposite end, we have optimum movement. But the problem here is that these terms, acceptable movement and optimum movement, are relative to the task being performed. So in a big picture, if you imagine trying to map this out for all possible tasks that you could ask of a human, there's not just one spectrum of bad, acceptable, optimal, but there's millions of them. Bad, acceptable, optimal, bad, acceptable, optimal, bad, acceptable, optimal, bad, acceptable, optimal. Right? Suddenly, we have this different spectrum here. And this is where we get back to bounded randomness. Bounded randomness is about causing us to perform within movements that are considered acceptable or optimal. The problem with the conventional gym industry or the conventional fitness industry's approach, which is, we're squatting today, so we're going to do the optimal squat, is that in the real world, you can't always perform the optimal movement. Sometimes you are going to move out of that optimal alignment and you still need to be strong there. In the first episode, we introduced the SAID principle, which is specific adaptation to imposed demand, which is essentially you get better at the things that you do. So if you always, as the typical gym industry does, do things optimally, right, you will get very, very, very strong in a very narrow band, right? And that's great as long as you stay in that band, but the real world doesn't let you. The real world will make you do things that are a little bit weird. Here's an example. Think about deadlifting. If you deadlift in a gym, you pick up a barbell that's nice and easy to grip, that fits nice and close to your shins, you can get the weight close to you, you can brace well, you can keep it close to your center of gravity, and you can pull that barbell up. Now think about trying to do a deadlift in the real world, picking up a couch. I bet you if you deadlift in the real world, picking up a couch, the way you deadlift a barbell, you're going to whack your head into the arm of the sofa most likely. You're going to find that you can't actually stand up fully with it. You're going to find that someone else is probably picking up the other end at the same time, so your timing's going to be all out, and so you're going to move a little bit funny, right? If you just develop in this narrow bands, the real world will take you outside of that. And if you haven't prepared for that, then you get injured by being taken into places that you're not ready for. So our concept of bounded randomness, far from being unsafe because it's introducing randomness and bad movement, it's actually far safer than thinking about movement as either good or bad and only moving optimally. Moving bounded randomly, and therefore moving within the broad spectrum of what's acceptable, including what's optimal, but not limited to what's optimal, is actually a far, 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 far safer way to move and to train. And that's the end of this episode. There is no such thing as a dichotomy between good and bad movement. In fact, judging movement, judging the validity of movement, sits on an almost infinite, an effectively infinite number of spectrums, each of which is judged based on the movement being required, or the task that requires movement, and that particular task has a spectrum of bad movement, acceptable movement, and optimal movement down this end. And the real world prevents us from always moving optimally, so we need to get good at moving acceptably. And to build capacity in that broader frame of acceptable movement, And bounded randomness operates in that frame of movement and therefore helps us to do that. Okie dokie. If you would like to know more about IDEANTHRO movement, if you would like to pose us a question, if you'd just like to find out more, here's how you can do some of that. You can find us at ideanthro.com/movement. You can find out all about our movement practice there. You can also find out about our facility in Oxley in Brisbane, Australia. You can also connect with us at ideanthro.com/connect. Okie dokie, that's it. Thanks for tuning in. If you liked this episode, give us a like and subscribe, or whatever the button on the social media network that you found this is. Okay, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.